Hello and good morning, good evening, good night to people across the globe who's watching today's show. We are glad to have you. Welcome to the Legal Zone, where we tackle injustice. Dr. Cheney, it's nice to see you today.
Good to see you.
Mr. John Salatti, how are you? You're on mute. I think you're on mute still.
There it is.
There
Sorry about that, but yes, great, feeling great. Great to be with you, Mr. Phillips. Always good to be here.
Glad to have you. And today we have a very special guest. I'm going to get into him in a minute. But first, let's talk. The last couple of shows, we've been talking about landlord-tenant issues, right? We've talked specifically about the gentrification, the housing. And last week we had another gentleman talk about that. He elaborated on it a little bit more. Today, we're going to talk more about the landlord-tenant relationship. We know that tenants, or landlords rather, they have a slew of rights. You know, they have the right to evict, which is a very powerful right. I just advised a client this past week about the self-help eviction. Self-help is basically removing a tenant without a court order to do so, as long as it's peaceful. And there are states across the United States that allow for that. But today we're going to talk about tenants' rights. And that's why we have today with us a Mr. Andrew McGuire. Andrew McGuire has been doing this for the last 27 years. He's been specifically helping District of Columbia residents fight for their homes. His Washington law firm is In Realm PLLC, and he's recovered millions of dollars for tenants in something that's called TOPA. And he's going to define that for us in a minute. TOPA. And he's going to give us his contact information after he's done. And he's going to elaborate more on how the TOPA plays in with the rights of tenants. Mr. Andrew McGuire, so glad to have you on with us today.
Solon, thank you for having me. And hi, John. Hi, Dr. Cheney. How are you doing?
Okay.
Okay, let's jump right into it. TOPA. Now, many people may not have heard of what this TOPA is. What does TOPA stand for?
So TOPA is an acronym for the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. It's a set of laws that exist, at least in my practice, for purposes of my practice, in the DC Code. It's law for the District of Columbia. There are TOPA rights in other parts of the United States, Baltimore City, Tacoma Park, Maryland, Minneapolis, I think, has enacted it. Oakland and Berkeley have enacted it. Austin is considering it. And it also exists in other forms with real estate contracts that you typically see on the commercial side. Usually people buying renting a space for a restaurant will usually want to have a right of first refusal in case the landlord decides to sell. And that's what TOPA really is all about. It's about tenants having rights when the landlord decides to sell. Those rights are pretty expansive. It's often misstated that the only purpose for TOPA is the right of first refusal, the right of the tenant to buy a property. And that is a big right. It's a significant part of TOPA, but it's not all that TOPA is about. TOPA is really about leverage in the District of Columbia. It's really about, was the intent of the framers of TOPA to basically give the tenants a better bargaining position when it comes time to their tenancy potentially being ended because the landlord decides he or she or it wants to sell their property. And there's nothing in TOPA that says they can't sell their property, but they have to go through a process. And the process includes certain notices, certain forms, and certain times and deadlines that the tenant then can exercise. My office helps tenants in these kinds of cases. There's lots of things that we can get out of the exercise of TOPA rights. First is knowledge, because there's just a lot of uncertainty among tenants when they first get notified by certified mail, typically, that the property is on the market or has already a contract on it. And many tenants naturally think, hey, I guess it's time for me to go. I guess I have to leave. Well, that's just not the law. That's not the law of the District of Columbia. And so education is really the best and foremost thing that I think my firm provides to tenants is, let's get up to speed with what the law really means, and let's get up to speed as to what your tenancy rights, which are extremely forceful in the District of Columbia. So it's just a matter of understanding your rights. That's the first part. The second part is, are you in a position to buy your house, your condo?
Well, that's the question that I was going to say. How many of these tenants are in a position to even buy? Like, is this law even necessary? Because do you have tons of tenants who say, okay, well, I've been renting for 20 years. Now I want to buy.
Well, the law is absolutely necessary. The reality is it's a market-based fix, in my view, for a lot of problems that ail a district like the District of Columbia. The huge speculation that's going on right now, the huge prices that are being paid per square foot, per door for real estate that is beyond the price level for even well-heeled tenants, like tenants who have money, tenants who have good credit, have good jobs. Some of the prices that they'll be looking at if their landlord decides to sell, they're competing against speculators. They're competing against money from often outside of the District of Columbia, outside of the United States. Quite often, we're talking about big development companies that come in and just purchase up homes, purchase up buildings. Sometimes they just let them sit there. Sometimes they develop them. But a tenant who is ready to buy their own home that they've lived in, say, 20 years or 10 years or 5 years, it's more likely that they won't have been there that long, that they don't really need my assistance to buy the property. If they've got a real estate agent, if they've got credit, if they've got pre-approved, if they've got a job and they've got everything they need to buy a property, they typically don't really need a lawyer to sort of assert their rights. I'm happy there are cases where you need a lawyer in those circumstances. Most of my client base are people who are not going to buy the property. Many of them are elderly. Many of them are poor. Many of them are on Section 8 vouchers or rapid rehousing vouchers or VA vouchers. Many of them are living in properties where the rent is quite low because of the history of rent control. So they've been in the building a long time. The amount of rent that they're paying is extremely low. And so all of this comes to a big shock to them when they think about having to move. And like I said, my first point of order is you don't have to move. Okay, so that's a big leverage point. What else can you use TOPA for if you're not going to buy the building? One is to buy some time. There's some time limits that are specific in the statute. And it just gives tenants a little bit of a breather to kind of figure out, well, what is my next move? Okay. It's not a lot of time. The landlords and the real estate agents, they gripe about these time periods all the time. Mostly it's because they don't understand the time periods. They don't do the right things. They don't file the right forms. But even when they do, it's not really that long a time. It depends on the type of property, whether it's a single family home or a 2 to 4 unit or 5 unit. The time differences are different for each property, but they're just barely enough time to basically sort of consider your options. During that time, what my office does is we look to see what the value of your TOPA rights are. Can you sell your TOPA rights? District of Columbia is one of the few places that specifically and have always, at least since 1980, made TOPA rights assignable, meaning you can sell your TOPA rights to somebody else. This gives you a lot of advantages, and depending on how you use it, of course. I got into this business after being a lawyer for a long time, doing all sorts of cases involving people with homes, bankruptcies and foreclosures, all sorts of stuff. And the thing about TOPA was I heard about tenants basically getting ripped off, so that you'd hear about a tenant sold his or her rights for the TOPA rights, which they, obviously didn't really know what it was. But somebody came along and said, I'll give you $50 for your TOPA rights. And they thought, wow, that's great. I wasn't going to buy this house anyways. That hustler, that middleman, totally legitimate, totally legal, then can sell those TOPA rights often for tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so when I saw this, I said, you know what, this was a statute designed to benefit tenants. And if I can help tenants get quality legal services and take all the time that they have under the statute to look at their options, if one of their options is, I can sell my rights have value, then it's a perfectly legitimate and normal exercise of the TOPA rights to sell your rights. And as you said in your intro, my firm has recovered millions of dollars for tenants over the last 6 years. So they're valuable, and it's essentially the tenant getting a seat at the table, at the development table. And so that has a real effect on things you've been talking about the last couple of weeks about gentrification and the way the city is changing and the cost of living and the cost of rents and, you know, buildings that are being redeveloped and vouchers. And I mean, it's really, it's a lot to unpack.
Now, does every tenant have these rights?
Yes. So every residential tenant does. There is no commercial TOPA. So restaurant owners or restaurant, you know, people who lease space for restaurants or clothing store or bodega or whatever, they don't have TOPA rights. If the landlord decides to sell, there's really nothing they can do. They can go and bid on it. They can try to buy it, but there's no guaranteed time frame by which they have a right, a unique right, and an exclusive right to buy the property. It's only residential tenants, tenants in single family homes, tenants in 2 to 4 units, and tenants in 5+ unit multi-units. Those are the classification of tenants. Tenants also very broadly defined. You know, a lot of people say, well, I moved in here with my cousin, you know, 10 years ago, and I've been sleeping on the couch ever since. Am I a tenant? I'm not on the lease. You know, but I have a key. I live here. You know, you're probably a tenant. You're probably going to be entitled to TOPA rights. So it's very expansive. The definition of tenant is very expansive. You don't have to have a written lease, for example. A lot of people in DC don't have written leases. A lot of people had written leases, which are typically 1 year length. And then, you know, then it goes into a month-to-month situation. A lot of times people throw away that original lease. They shouldn't do that, but they do. And so you could have people who haven't had a lease in 10 years. You can have people who moved in without a lease. You can have people who live in air property. Air property is a real tricky one, but
What's air
when you have people, so air property is somebody owns title to a house or a building in District of Columbia, and that person has died. That person died maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago. And you have basically the family controlling the asset, living in there, but the title is always a little bit fuzzy, so they're hard to sell. And so sometimes I have clients who are the last one in the property, and sometimes they have TOPA rights and sometimes they don't. So that's another area where it's helpful to have a lawyer. But we've been really successful in helping all sorts of tenants. Sometimes before they ever get their TOPA notice, they can clearly tell the property is being marketed to be sold. I mean, sometimes there might be a for sale sign in front of the house or the building, right? And the tenants are thinking, wait a second, I thought I was supposed to get my offer of sale. I thought I was supposed to get some notice. Well, the Court of Appeals, which I think has done a really good job at sort of helping define what TOPA is and what it isn't, and the procedures and so forth, has basically said that that decision when you get your paperwork is largely up to the landlord and can go even up to arguably even through a closing. So there's just a lot of legal issues that are still sort of out there with regards to when you get your TOPA notice, how long your rights extend, what happens if your landlord retaliates against you. That happens quite a bit. So we are often in landlord-tenant court. We're often in housing code court. That ability to assign your TOPA rights is the reason why I am representing these people. So these clients can pay me. I'm not a free lawyer. I'm not a pro bono lawyer. I don't work for the government. I'm a private lawyer. I've been in business a long time. I'd like to think I'm a very good lawyer. And I like to think that poor people or tenants should be able to get the best. They should be able to go out there and trade on this right that they have. No different than If you were a developer and you were going to buy into a really profitable business, lawyers might be lining up to represent you and say, hey, I'll represent you on a contingency, or I'll represent you on a commission. When you sell that property, that's when I'll get paid. So that's kind of how I work with tenants. It's very easy for tenants to hire me. They don't pay me anything up front. Mine is all a contingency on any money that I collect or any other benefits that we sometimes see. Sometimes we get people extended rental periods. Sometimes we get people discounts on rent. Sometimes we get landlords to forgive old rent. Sometimes we get promises of repairs. Sometimes we get all of the above and some money. So, I mean, it's really a great, fantastic right that the residents of the District of Columbia have. It's incredibly unique, and it's been basically operating in the city. First piece of the legislation during Home Rule. It was one of the first basically major pieces of legislation that came out of what was the very first city council.
It sounds very similar to the rights of redemption for foreclosures for homeowners, that they have a right to reclaim the house after a foreclosure, and they could sell that right to other people. Now tell me, what happens if a homeowner ignores it and they sell the building, the house, or whatever, and they never give the tenant the opportunity to purchase? Is there any recourse?
Sure is, and it's painful. It's usually painful for the buyer and the seller. The reality is there's lots of deals that happen like that. There are lots of cases where tenants are not informed, and come to find out that there's a new landlord in town. He's collecting rent. The old guy's out, the new guy's in, and sometimes those cases never see the light of day. That's true. It's a little bit unusual, particularly in this market now that's so speculative, it's so hot. That there's so much money being thrown at this area from banks. The banks are really aware of TOPA, and the banks do not want to get their properties in that kind of situation where, a year after the transaction, somebody's coming along saying, where's my TOPA rights? We're going to undo this entire deal. It's going to be a very costly piece of litigation for the buyer and the seller, and the tenants are already there. They have got nothing to lose. They might as well litigate the case. Some cases are worth litigating, some are not. Sometimes you get a better landlord, and maybe you might just say, hey, I'm happy with the new management. I'm happy with
So the entire process could be undone if I buy a
Absolutely.
property and they'll give me my money back and I have to turn the property back over?
Yeah. I mean, the case law is littered with TOPA cases that have lasted for 10 years, 15 years, real drag out battles. And it's unfortunate. And a lot of it has to do with the lack of transparency. And that's one of the things I really push, is transparency in the process. This is a commercial process. It's a totally normal, everyday process as far as I'm concerned with my tenants. People, sometimes look at tenants like they're aliens. They got antennas coming out of their head. They're normal commercial actors. They make commercial decisions every single day, okay? Tenants are very sensitive to changes in the market. They're very sensitive to rent increases. They're very conscious of, my stove isn't working, my refrigerator isn't working. They're conscious of the idea that that's not what I paid for. What should I do about it? Now, a lot of times tenants feel very vulnerable, so they don't always push the envelope. But when it comes to TOPA, that's the time to push the envelope, because you usually have a seller who, for whatever reason, is trying to sell. And my experience is sellers sell. They need to sell. They want to sell. Maybe they're trying to retire. Maybe the business isn't doing well. Maybe they need to pay some other debts. Maybe they just want to give their kids a college education. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. They're usually very bent on selling. And so there's a ton of leverage there. And it's a very unique situation in the District of Columbia, and it's far greater than, say, rights of redemption and foreclosures. I mean, the people who are foreclosed upon, for example, who stay behind after the bank takes ownership, there's some question about whether those people get TOPA rights. They often do. They often are given an offer of sale by the bank when the bank decides to sell, not the foreclosure sale. The foreclosure sale is exempt from TOPA. There's a few kinds of transactions that are exempt from TOPA, really very small group of transactions involving say a couple, a husband and a wife that are divorcing and selling their property, might be a rental property. When they sell it, there's no TOPA. It's just what the law says. There's a few other examples like that, but you know, it's always helpful if you are ever a tenant and you either think your property is about to be sold or is in the process of being sold, or you've been given your offer of sale, to check in with somebody, check in with a lawyer. I'd love you to call me, check in with, there's other lawyers in town that do this kind of business. Real estate agents are getting involved in it. You know, what you just have to remember is you've got something really valuable. And the first guy coming along saying, hey, I'll give you $50 or I'll give you $5 or $3 or you know, whatever.
Even
$100. $100. Oh, the smallest one we've seen was a $2 bill. Now, the funny thing is when some of these middlemen and real estate agents, you know, get greedy, they'll try to trick the tenants out for no dollars, $0. And you know what? Those people can come to me because you haven't properly assigned your rights. You must get some consideration. You must get something from it. If somebody has completely tricked you out of your rights with paying you nothing, meaning no extra rent, no writing rent off, no, hey, discount on the rent this month. I mean, you're talking about absolutely nothing, then you haven't properly been compensated for your TOPA rights, and you still may have a TOPA claim.
Now, if I'm a tenant and I found out that the landlord is selling my unit and I want to exercise my TOPA right, is there any financial assistance to help me do that?
There is. I got to tell you, it's, you know, part of the injustice of all this, I think, is the way that the city has kind of looked at TOPA. They haven't funded it. The funds that are available are usually in multi-unit settings. So we're talking about 5 units or more. And, you know, the programs are really underfunded. They're not advertised. I mean, I've been doing this for a while and I've never really seen any effort by DHCD to get some of this money out there, which I know is being allocated. The other reality is the market is just so speculative right now. I mean, the government is not going to loan even low-income tenants or deserving tenants money to buy into a property that is grossly inflated in price. And this leads to the gentrification. Why is it being grossly inflated in price? Because the nature of the building is likely going to change. It's going to be converted to condominiums. It's going to be torn down and turned into, you know, a 6-unit instead of a 3-unit. It could be that the developers need to come in and change who the tenants are, from market rate tenants who are paying below market rate because they're rent controlled to Section 8 voucher tenants who are not subject to rent control. And as of right now, Section 8 tenants are, they're rolling out the red carpet for Section 8 tenants. They have a lot of leverage right now because the government pays a lot more money per unit than what a normal landlord would expect to get. And that cuts through the entire city. All wards. TOPA is a really interesting thing that cuts across race, religion, everything, because the tenant in Ward 2 is often aligned, at least with regards to TOPA, with the tenant in Ward 8. I mean, there's just a lot of things that you see, commonalities that I see with my tenants, regardless of what part of the city they're from, where they feel a little bit less than. Like, you know, I'm supposed to feel like my landlord is a lord. You know, I hate that term landlord. I have to use it because everyone uses it, but the city calls them housing providers. I like that a lot more, but it just doesn't roll off the tongue. So yeah, I hate landlords. I mean, they're not anybody's lord. You know, in the District of Columbia, the tenant is the lord. They're sitting in the building. They say possession 90, what is it, ownership, possession is 90% of the law, whatever that old expression is. It really is true. I mean, in the District of Columbia, tenants rule the roost. I always say that the landlord, there's that word again, the landlord owns the door. They own the physical door, but the tenant controls who comes in and out of the door completely, 100%, including against the landlord. Landlords can't just waltz into your home. You know, they don't have any right to just show up one day and say, I'm here to, you know, sit down and look at your couch or, you know, inspect the property. I mean, there's rules and regulations that control that, but the tenants have tons and tons of power. And it's been kind of untapped. You know, there really hasn't been any effort to come along and help people. And, you know, it's a small niche group of lawyers that do this kind of work. Part of my thing about transparency, I would love to see more lawyers get into this. I really would. I mean, it's helping people. And there are thousands of cases every year. And I would say maybe half of them tenants are actually getting some sort of help, some sort of counseling. There are pro bono outfits that help people. There's the Office of Tenant Advocate, which is a government agency that can explain your TOPA rights. They're very good and on top of changes in law. And, you know, we don't always see eye to eye on what the law says, but, you know, private attorneys are also doing TOPA cases. My practice is just TOPA. That's all I do.
How can someone get in touch with you if they wanted to talk to you directly?
So I have a 1-800 number, 1-800-284-TOPA.
1-800-284-TOPA. Our producer could put that in the bottom caption.
And you can also check out my website, which is www.topamarket.com. That's TOPAMARKET.com. That's what I'm trying to do here, is create a market, basically bringing in willing buyers, willing sellers, making the process a lot more transparent, not so underground, you know, making sure that some of that sunlight comes out, that the process is regulated. Cases that are unusual, like you said an example of a property where they didn't give the proper notice to anybody. I see those cases. I have those cases. Sometimes developers foolishly go to title companies, you know, in Baltimore County. You know, they go hundreds of miles away to close a deal, and those title companies don't really know the law of the District of Columbia. Out-of-state buyers sometimes buy things, they don't even care about TOPA, they don't even know what it is. Usually these things are caught by savvy title companies like we have in the District of Columbia. So anybody closing a deal like this, I mean, you know, you gotta, you should have your own legal counsel. I deal with title companies all the time. I deal with lawyers all the time. The buyers have lawyers, the sellers have lawyers, the tenants should have lawyers, and they do.
Dr. Cheney, I know you have tons of questions for Andrew. Go ahead with them. Oh, wait a minute, you're on mute. Let me unmute you. Yeah, unmute your mic. There you go.
Attorney McGuire,
Good morning.
good morning. I'm glad you came on the show.
I'm happy to be here.
People talking about TOPA. Well, in preparation for this discussion, I did a little cursory research. And one of the things that I know now, housing is a global matter. I looked at some internet research, of course, the USA, Europe, and they talk about a global property guide that would list landlord and tenant relationships and rank whether you're pro-tenant or pro-landlord. So that was interesting. And I came across housing finance, even in Africa, Sierra Leone. Anywhere there are people, renters, owners, we're talking about housing. So you covered a lot of what I want to cover. And I'll quickly just go over this. So the upshot, worldwide, we have housing matters. We all agree to that. Here in the US, I was looking at an article last night about Minnesota. And I actually reached out to this Minnesota journalist, telling the person about your being on the show today, and that they can see it next week. And when they go on and share it with their people, because in Minnesota, and I'll get to the other places that you've already mentioned, what I think is really interesting is that Minnesota is using the DC TOPA model, as well as a lot of these other places that you've mentioned. And I want to ask you, Minnesota said that, well, generally Minnesota is saying, the lawmakers are saying that if TOPA is properly implemented, it could aid in affordable housing. So that's their big thing. So what do you think about that? Or do you think they're moving in the right direction? Do you have the preservation of affordable housing?
Yeah, so Minnesota and Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a lot like Washington, D.C. It's a big urban area. It's very attractive. Jobs are there. The schools are there. That's where everyone's moving. And so it's putting on a huge pressure on the poor people that live there already. And so I hear this about affordable housing all the time, particularly in DC. There's a lot of talk by the politicians about, we have this fund and it's supposed to help affordable housing, and TOPA, you shouldn't use it this way because that doesn't help affordable housing. Listen, the people that I represent, the tenants, they already have the affordable housing. They're already in their homes paying what is affordable. I mean, they may not like it. They may think that, because of the cockroaches and the refrigerator not working, they should pay less rent. But generally speaking, if they're living there, they're content. Okay. And so they've already got the deal that they want. They've got the affordable housing. Affordable housing is generally thought of as a future policy. In other words, well, what happens with this building in Mount Pleasant if these tenants move out? They're all rent control. Their rents are so low. If it gets converted to something else, if it gets converted to condos and then we sell it to individual owners, how will that change the dynamics? Will rents go up? Will rents go down? Will workforce housing, will people be able to live in there that work nearby? Or do we have a situation where poor people have to commute, 2-3 hours to get into the city core? So there's a lot of talk about creating and maintaining affordable housing, which I genuinely think is great government policy. But I'm where the rubber hits the road. I mean, my tenants are the ones who are looking at being displaced. They are the ones who are losing the affordable housing. What are they going to get compensated for if they're going to lose the affordable housing, so that, a police officer or a fireman or a teacher? So when you hear about affordable housing, particularly in DC, generally you're talking about income minimums, not maximums, around $60,000 to $80,000. If you don't make that kind of money, when they talk about affordable housing, they're not talking about you. So that means older people who are on fixed incomes, disabled people on fixed incomes, people who don't make $60,000 to $80,000 a year. There's a lot of people that don't. When you hear the mayor or anybody else talking about affordable housing, they're not talking about those folks. They're talking about people who they're targeting. They're trying to increase the wealth of the city, essentially. In the middle is where they're looking. And it is displacing poor people by and large throughout the city. And my view is that if the tenants are getting displaced, they can set a price by which they say, okay, everyone is commoditizing my tenancy, I will too. And I will, take a buyout, move out, and that's that. And so what's interesting is most of my clients who take buyouts and move out end up moving within a quarter mile of their current residence. There's this myth that, everyone has to move to Maryland or everyone has to move to Virginia. Well, neither Maryland or Virginia is very cheap either, I can tell you that. But, by and large, DC residents, when they go through the TOPA process, remain DC residents.
What's the typical buyout amount?
So I have to be kind of careful about that. My recommendation is that it's got to be in the tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, because when you start calculating just bare moving costs, obviously it depends. I mean, if you're moving out a family of 3 that's lived in a property for 20 years versus somebody who's rented a condo in Georgetown for a month or 6 months, right? Moving costs could be different, but you're definitely talking about minimum $5,000 in moving costs. There's transfer costs. When you move into a new place, you usually have to pay a security deposit and first month's rent. You're still waiting for your other security deposit where you're leaving to come back to you. So there's this sort of lag in sort of transferring this money to that. And so, you really have to understand the market, because at the end of the day, it's a market price. So I get a lot of times, I get tenants coming to me and say, hey, I'm going to make a lot of money on this TOPA deal, right? I mean, my landlord is selling. He doesn't have a buyer yet, but he's selling. So surely we can make something out of it. Well, I look at the price. The landlord wants $1 million trillion gazillion dollars for you know, a 4-unit that's dilapidated and has lots of housing code violations. Okay. And I'll tell the tenant, like, well, your rights are to buy this building at this price. No one in their right mind would want to buy this building at this price. So right now, your TOPA rights are worth 0. Let's let the market hit this guy. Let's find some buyer who comes in, and then we can compare what the buyer is paying compared to what the property is really worth. So real quick example, you have somebody living in a 4-unit in Anacostia, and the owner shows up one day and gives everyone the TOPA notice. It's supposed to be delivered by certified mail, but sometimes they hand deliver it in addition. And it says, I am selling my property for $550,000 to this, you know, developer who just happened to be, you know, walking by one day and said, I'd like to buy your property. And, you know, I bought this property 30 years ago, so it sounds like a good price to me. Well, I mean, you know, those assets right now are going for $800,000 on a bad day. And it to me, it just seems completely crazy. The inflation that you see in housing, which is an injustice, if you want to talk about injustice, it's just pricing everybody out. And so local investors can't buy those. You're dealing with out-of-state investors who are going to buy these properties. However, if they're getting a steal of a deal, if they're getting that property for 550, and any developer worth his or her salt would pay 800 for it, that delta is the value of your TOPA rights. So I don't want people to think that when you have TOPA rights, like winning the lottery, that you're automatically going to, you know, be set for life. Frankly, it's can be good money. One of the other things I'm really proud about my practice is that the tenants that I represent, by and large, when they get these sizable buyouts, they use the money for housing. They use the money to make intelligent decisions about improving their situation. Somebody gave me an analogy about a goldfish never gets bigger than the fishbowl that you put it in. And that, you know, I tell that to tenants a lot of times, and they say, you know, I've been stuck in this place for a long time and I've never really liked it. And I've always thought about moving, but they never had that incentive. They never had the money. And so, you know, when people get these buyouts, they, you know, by and large, they improve their condition. They are better customers. They're more educated customers, and cash is king. They've got money. They can make deals happen. And so I've had tenants buy homes. I've had certainly most of my tenants, most of my clients who move on will tell me, you know, after they've moved in, they'll call me up, Mr. McGuire, this place is so much nicer. I can't believe why I didn't leave this place 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so there's just a lot going on, like Ari was talking about last week. There's just so much going on in the city. It's happening in all corners, and there's just a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure, and there's just so much money floating around and banging around. It's really concerning because poor people are usually the ones getting the short end of the stick. And so there are lawyers out there who are looking out, and trying to help people who are tenants. Like I say, tenants in Ward 8, tenants in Ward 1. You could be college students renting you could be American University college students renting something in, AU Park. You could be a retiree in a big building in Southwest. You could be, a single mother on a voucher in a house in Deanwood. Every one of you has some value in what you've got. And so use it, read the forms, read the paperwork real carefully. And don't sign anything. A lot of these people, when they come up and they want you to sign something, they'll usually bring a notary. That's a good sign that something's a little bit not right. And they won't give you a copy of it most of the time. When I hear people say I signed away my rights, which is really depressing because there's not much I can do for them at that point. The stories I hear about don't read it. You don't want to buy this place. That's all it says. This paper says that you get to stay. And we're going to give you $50 or, a coupon or something like that. It's really atrocious what people get away with, but they do. And I aim to stop that. I'm trying to help as many people. If they don't want to hire me, that's great. But I want everyone to understand, tenants need to understand, you've got something of value. You wouldn't just give it away the first person asks for it.
Okay. The other thing I have here is with your list, I have Berkeley, California, Oakland, New York City, Massachusetts, and of course Minnesota, and I'm sure there are other places. And they're all pushing for TOPA. And again, they're using the DC model. Here's what I want to ask you. Do you think the lawmakers, because I am not totally pleased with TOPA model in DC. I think there are a lot of flaws to it. As you know, I have been involved with TOPA, and TOPA can change your life. I also know about somebody who came from across the street, and they waited it out when the building was transitioning. They walked away with $60,000. And then there are some of us who might have walked away with nothing. It's very interesting. Do you think DC lawmakers are aware of their TOPA efforts being examined by these different states and used to help these cities? And should DC do more of the same with TOPA since they're really in the spotlight? Do you think they realize that this is going on? That it's being examined and it's being used by these other locations in the U.S.?
You know, the efforts by these other cities to look at DC as a model should be applauded. Frankly, the council has a number of people on it who are very hostile to TOPA. Anita Bonds and Chairman Mendelson are the two that I have to, highlight. They often, talk a good game about being progressive and, for poor people. And but when it comes to TOPA, they destroyed TOPA, or at least they sought to destroy TOPA in 2018. Okay, and so while other cities and states are looking at TOPA as a model, in 2017, 2018, there was a real effort to completely undermine the entire TOPA structure. It was largely funded by real estate agents from Bethesda, real estate agents from Arlington. It was really atrocious. Watching it happen in the city council as it unfolded was really eye-opening to me. The hostility that some of the people on the council had for tenants, and the these poor landlords, these landlords in Temple Hills or in College Park, and they own a property in DC. We should feel sorry for them when they decide to sell and cash out, make a lot of money. So I do think that they're aware that we're being looked at for sure. And to those jurisdictions that are still thinking about TOPA, I've been held up as the bad guy, right? The ambulance chasing guy. You don't want that. Well, let me tell you, if you don't make the TOPA rights assignable, then you might as well not really pass any of your TOPA legislation, because as Solon pointed out, quite often we're talking about low-income tenants, no-income tenants, and in competitive housing markets. So giving them the right to buy the property just by itself, come on. I mean, you're not really giving anybody any affordable housing that way. The only way to give affordable housing is to make sure that the tenants can stop the deal, or they can change who's in the deal, and that they can exercise their rights over time, that they can parlay their right of refusal into getting legal help or getting some other kind of assistance, that they can cash out, that they can use that legal right, where there is some kind of value to their rights, to transition in a better way, and not just be shunted aside. So I'm a big proponent of these different areas with their actions that they're taking, and I think most of them do not have assignability. I think some of them may come to the conclusion that is something they need to do. But like I said, here in the district, although we still have arguably the only and the best sort of TOPA framework for tenants, it was largely undermined in 2017, 2018 with regard to people in single family homes. Now I'm litigating against this as we speak. There is a lot of question about what happened to tenants who moved in 10 years ago or 20 years ago before the law changed. So the law changed in 2018, basically says if you're in a single family home, you don't have TOPA rights anymore. If the landlord decides to sell, there's just a few little, notice forms that they have to send you, but you have no rights. You can't sell your rights, etc. They try to make an exception for disabled and elderly folks, but even that doesn't apply. If you're an elderly or disabled person, you moved into a building in 2019, and 2 years later, the owner decides to sell, you don't have any TOPA rights. And you can thank Anita Bonds and Phil Mendelson for that largely. I have to say, everybody in the council almost unanimously voted for it. The mayor.
That's just for the single family homes, though,
Just
right?
for the single family home. And they were, listen, the real estate agents saw an opening, and they were telling Phil Mendelson, go all the way, man, get rid of all of it. We don't want tenants to have these kind of rights. What in the heck are we doing? Letting the people who live in these buildings decide, who owns the building. So we're always on the lookout for efforts to change the law. But in the meantime, fighting like crazy for tenants while we still got it.
Can you hear me okay?
Now we can.
Okay. This is my last part. And I kind of like this. Maybe that's why we researchers select what we select. What is interesting is many of these cities are examining and eliminating the DC TOPA roadblocks or the problems in TOPA. For example, to ensure a landlord accepts a good faith offer made by tenants or affordable housing developers, and is not purposely refusing the offer in order to accept a higher bid. And you know about that. Another, TOPA rights are treated by all renters in the market by the landlord, including what we just talked about, the reversal of the amended DC law preventing that previously applied to single family housing. In the Berkeley bill, for example, it will apply to all renters. So that supports what you're trying to do, I guess. And another, the goal is to act to protect people who cannot afford to purchase a property. Another one, and I think about a colleague of mine years ago with this example. She suddenly had to leave the office to run to Virginia because she was being tossed out. Her family was being tossed out of their house because of this 2008-2009 housing crisis. So they're talking about the rights and wrongs of the 2009 housing crisis that targeted Black and brown people in the San Francisco Bay cities or areas. This woman was in Northern Virginia. Another, participating organizations must show commitment to permanent, affordable, and democratic residential control that allow people to participate in that thing. Here's my question to you. Do you think there are significant roadblocks which have watered down the purpose of DC TOPA? And do you think that's true? And if it's good, that if these examinations are taking place?
Well, I like your use of the word roadblock, okay? Because the real estate agents are going to get all upset about this, but that's essentially what these are. These are more speed bumps, I guess, than roadblocks, right? In other words, you want to sell your house, I get it, Mr. Landlord. You want to buy this house, I get it, Mr. Developer, but you're going to have to wait. You're going to have to wait for the tenant to go through these steps. If they don't exercise their rights, you could be going forward with your sale within 22 days. You could be going forward with your sale within a month. Tenants have to affirmatively exercise their rights. When they do, like I say, speed bumps, roadblocks, I don't believe they're sufficient. I mean, if you really, really were committed to giving tenants an opportunity to buy, you're talking about people who are going from being a tenant to being an owner in 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. It's very difficult. Just financed people buying their second or third or fourth home or investment homes, whatever, they have a hard time closing in 20 or 30 or 60 days, right? So you're trying to get a tenant who's starting from ground zero. You know, do you have your tax returns for the last couple of years? That's what you're going to need to get a mortgage. Do you have your pay stubs in order? Do you have you checked your credit? And, you know, there's so many things. So my view is more speed bumps, the better. The longer the process, the more advantage certainly the tenants have. The real estate people cry foul about this all the time, but I've been involved in so many transactions where once the TOPA is taken care of, it's back to being a normal real estate transaction. These guys can't close ever. I mean, there are always delays in closing, and oh, we didn't have the document, we didn't have the payoff statement, you know, somebody's in Greece, somebody can't sign because they're sick. You know, they cry about, oh, the TOPA process takes too much time. Real estate, the sale of real estate takes time. And so I would love to see TOPA enhanced by tenants getting more time. I'd also love to see, for example, the mayor's affordable housing fund, all $100 million of it just sitting there, you know, apparently helping developers, but where's the help to the tenants? You know, it's extremely difficult in this market, but we do come across deals quite often where there's a delta, where the tenants could be getting a good deal on buying a property. The reality is that because there's no financing behind it, the reality is most of the time they're going to sell their rights and take that delta, take that cash, and let somebody else come in and develop it. But I'd love to see a fund that targeted individual tenants, particularly single-family homes. Single-family homes, I think, is really the movement of the future in the District of Columbia. It's the majority of housing. It's about 2/3 of the housing. A huge chunk of it is rental housing. And when you look at the commoditization of real estate, boy, look no further than single-family homes. Think about Airbnb. You know, think about subletting. Think about you know, people and running businesses out of their homes. You know, tenants, they're using the space in ways that you know, we didn't always think was normal or right. And now people don't think twice about it. You know, you could be a tenant. If your lease doesn't say you can't sublet, you could sublet. If your lease doesn't have any prohibition against subletting, then you probably could run an Airbnb out of your rental apartment. And people do. And so everybody kind of getting into that game. I've had developers reach out to me. The next model of housing is going to be, you don't buy the house, you buy a room in the house. So it's like a cooperative, but it's going to be, you own your individual right in a single family home. So they're going to start creating cooperatives within homes. And these are all clever ways to conceptualize the ownership and occupation of real estate. You know, as long as the tenants have their TOPA rights, you know, all of this stuff can happen. And tenants by and large are not trying to get in the way of development or progress in the city. A lot of them are living in properties that are frankly substandard, major housing code problems, a lot of deferred maintenance. Usually the landlord is, you know, cash poor and property rich. It might have been somebody who bought the property 30 years ago, right? When properties, which today are selling for millions of dollars, they got for $30,000. Maybe they've refinanced it a couple of times, but the bottom line is these are older people who are usually thinking about retirement. These are landlords that we often come across, and they just don't have the money to fix the properties up. And when it comes down time to sell it, and you're asking the tenants for a favor, you know, do me a favor, let me sell my property without you going through the TOPA process. You know, it's not usually very hard sell for me to have these tenants come to me and say, listen, this guy never fixed anything. We would complain about this, we complain about it. He would never fix anything. But when he showed up for the rent, we paid the rent. And so, you know, I say, listen, you got to think with your head on these TOPA, not your heart. This is not a time to get revenge. This is a time to act like a developer yourself. You have a seat at the development table, use it and use it to your advantage. In a lot of cases, because this is a DC crazy real estate market, if you can hitch a ride onto a real estate deal in some way or another, you're going to do really well. And so I love the success I've had with tenants. I give them big fat checks on a regular basis, and they're extremely grateful. They're grateful for the law. They're really grateful for the protections that they have, and they're staying in DC. They're using their money and they're staying in DC. And there's I've had multiple clients call me second and third time that they've been through this process. So there's a huge liquidation going on also in the city. I think Ari was talking a little bit about that. I mean, stuff is selling. Neighborhoods are selling that heretofore no one ever thought about. Is it a good thing for the city? I mean, I don't know. I live in the city and I've lived here a long time, and some change is inevitable. But my job is, again, to help the tenants. If there's going to be displacement, they don't pay the cost of it. The buyer, the seller, somebody in the chain, in the real estate chain, let them pay for it. The tenant shouldn't have to pay for their displacement.
John, you have anything to ask?
Well, first I want to say, oftentimes what we're doing here is, we talk about injustice, and it's in the our subtitle, and it's nice to have a conversation where mostly what we're talking about is the justice, right? That you're bringing the justice, as opposed to, well, here's this bad thing that's happened, and here's this bad thing and where's the injustice? That's kind of a lot of what our conversations end up being. But here, Andrew, here's the justice. By and large, that has been your presentation. So kudos to you for that. I'm hoping we're able to explore more of those kinds of questions. I think, to get to what Solon was putting out there for me, you may have covered it, but I'm going to try to see if I can ask this more precisely, building on what Dr. Cheney was saying about things about TOPA. So if I phrase it this way, Andrew, you're going to get to upgrade TOPA from when justice really was on people's minds in 1975, which are saying, 2021, justice isn't quite so much on people's minds. That is, when I say people at the elected level who create these things. But you, Andrew, now have a chance to, shall we say, channel that spirit of 1975. What would you do that you haven't already described, or that Dr. Cheney hasn't put on the table, to make TOPA really realistic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that really is kind of making me think hard here. I mean, so besides funding, like we just discussed, in addition to maybe changing the law to increase the times that tenants have. I don't think that's a likely scenario, but I mean, the law has been in same form since 1980, basically. All the time limits, everything has been mostly the same since 1980. It seems to have found the right balance as far as time. The 2018 law, I'd get rid of that. Everybody in single family homes should have TOPA, and quite a few of them do, if I'm correct, and the law is not retroactive. So if you moved in before July of 2018 and you're in a single family home and now it's going for sale, you call me, because we believe that you still have TOPA rights. But a really interesting question, or an area that I would maybe focus on if I had my magic wand, I guess, would be to try to make things more transparent. And that would probably start with the agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, which is a really, really important agency. It actually broke off from DCRA back in, I think, the early 2000s. And it took a lot of really important functions with it. It's probably, I don't think anybody would argue that it's properly funded. It's probably underfunded, it's understaffed. But they have, a lot of challenges on their hands because they're dealing with rent control. They're dealing with almost the entire landlord-tenant relationship as far as rent increases and leases and things like that. TOPA is a big part of it. DOPA, which is the District Opportunity to Purchase Act, giving the district an opportunity to purchase buildings. So they get these offers of sale that are by law required. They're the ones that make the forms. They're the ones that produce them on their website, and they're the ones Those are the forms that all the real estate agents and developers and sellers and landlords use. And the law requires that you also send a copy to DHCD. DHCD then is a repository of these public documents. I've asked them, I said, can I come in and look at all these documents? And they said, absolutely not. They produce a list every week that they put up and that tells me what properties are at issue. I try to knock on those doors. I try to send people postcards. I try to reach out to tenants. But if transparency, which I think would help the situation, DHCD needs to be reformed. So I can go on the recorder of deeds and find out a whole heck of a lot about your house or this building or whatever. I mean, I can see when you got a mortgage, I can see how much the mortgage is, I can see who else owned the property, I can see whether you're in any court battles over the property. I mean, there's a lot of things I can see. I can go into rent control records, I can see all those things. I can go into DCRA records and see if there's been housing code violations, but I can't go into the DHCD website and see these offers of sale. I'd love to see that happen. It would ultimately benefit the tenants. There would be far more competition. Instead of a single tenant being solicited by one person, some real estate agent who is the first guy who shows up and says, hey, I'll buy your rights for $50 right now, right? Instead of that one guy, there might be 20 people showing up. And at that point, the tenant's going to realize, like, listen, if I got 20 people trying to buy this from me, I'm not gonna sign the first deal for $50. So I'd love to see more transparency from DHCD. DHCD has a quasi-judicial function. They issue decisions in certain kind of administrative hearings or TOPA cases, TOPA complaints. I'd love to see those things more published, so that the general public could find the stuff on their own. I do a lot of work as far as FOIAs and things like that. I get these things. So I get TOPA forms and I get their internal rules and regulations, and I get decisions that they've made that have presidential value. I do this for my clients. I do this for my business. I would love to see them as the repository, the library, so to speak, to make it accessible to everybody in a much easier way. But transparency would be really good. DHCD is by law supposed to keep statistics on this. They don't do it. There was a totally dishonest study that was done by Anita Bonds in the 2017-2018 single family home exemption legislation. I mean, it was just the most dishonest, no methodology whatsoever. And, it claimed that only 2 people out of 1,000 ever bought their homes through TOPA, single family homes, which I know is just simply not true. But if DHCD has the manpower or the people power to study this stuff, all the data is right there in front of them. Why aren't they producing this stuff? Why aren't they going to the council saying, hey, TOPA is working, or TOPA is not working, or DOPA is working, or DOPA is not working? I think that the council gets reports from them, but not nearly as granular as they could. So that's a really great question. I probably have to think a little bit more on that, but I love it.
All right. Thank you. Give us that number one more time, the 1-800 number.
1-800-284-TOPA. That is 1-800-284-8672. 1-800-284-TOPA.
All righty, there you have it, everyone. Andrew McGuire fighting for the rights of tenants within Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, Andrew, for coming on the show. And it was a pleasure being educated by all the information that you gave us today.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to seeing your next show.
All righty, thank you.
Up the good work.
Let me unmute. Dr. Cheney, I had to mute you because your mic was giving some feedback. So what are your thoughts? I'll start with you, Dr. Cheney.
She's still muted.
You're still muted. Unmute yourself.
Yeah.
No, do it again. Keeps going off and on. There you go. It just muted again. All right, while she's doing that, John, what did you?
Well,
Oh, there you go. No, you keep going in and out. I think you have a bad connection on your mic. John, while we're waiting on her, what are your thoughts on today's show?
well, to go back to our usual theme about injustice.
Right.
All right, if we flip that out a moment, where Andrew just was really pointed out an injustice, even in the sense that DC has what is essentially a unique law, right, in the entire country.
Right. Which is now starting to grow to other cities, though.
Right. It's going, but still for 40 years now, it's kindly stood alone. And yet it's still set up with the people who are supposed to benefit being in a one down position. You know, maybe they'll get the information, but how will they get it? They're not generally in a good, they're not the developer, they're not the landlord. They don't have the kind of general knowledge of how all this works. All of a sudden, some days, maybe you get this thing that says, oh, we're going to sell and we'll give you some scant amount of money for you to go now. But there's nothing as part of the law that says we want to be proactive as a community, as a city, to say when this happens, let's say DHCD is the department, is going to come to that building, whether it's a single family or a multi-unit building, and we're now going to tell you, this is where you're at, and this is what you can do. And no, we're not going to do this for you. That is, you want to go talk to Andrew McGuire, great, but we're going to at least come and have a meeting with you so you really understand what your situation is before this thing all starts rolling and deadlines are popping and blah, 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 blah.
You,
There's
the tenant.
the injustice.
Right. And you say you, when you say you mean the tenant.
Right. The tenants would be getting this information directly from, let's say, DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development. That DHCD would go to the building and say, look, your owner is looking to now sell. Before that gets underway, we want to explain to you all, here's the process.
Right.
Here are people you can get in touch with, blah, blah, blah. But this just doesn't come out of the blue to someone who just is, you should not be reasonably expected to know all this.
Right.
You'll have your people, you'll have your Dr. Cheneys, what have you. But the average tenant,
They won't know.
you know,
Dr.
it's
Cheney,
kind of that wink,
you're
wink
muted
kind
now.
of thing that we're doing this, but
Right.
we're not doing it wholeheartedly.
Okay, Dr. Chan, I think you're unmuted now.
I agree that the average person doesn't know a whole lot about TOPA, and it can be a nightmare. When it happened to me, I was tenant president of the building where I live, and I went to school, so to speak. I found the experts online, what they had to say, and I learned. And there's so much more to TOPA because it just transforms your life because you're at it every minute. And we were fortunate. We did have somebody to help us. That person was an attorney. He was traveling back and forth to Morocco, and he left a lot to us. And we did. So TOPA is really important to people that don't have means to buy houses and that kind of thing. There are flaws or roadblocks, but I guess it's expected. And I just think it's so interesting that these other places, these other jurisdictions are using the DC model.
Yeah, it shows the importance of it, so that so many other cities are starting to implement the same TOPA law.
What happens if they want to use the show as showing it around?
What was that?
A lot of people may actually want to use the show to share it around the country.
Yep, they could do that. I think Andrew did an excellent job breaking down all the ins and outs of TOPA, at the very least, to get someone interested enough to look into it on their own. Dr. Cheney, John Salatti, thank you so much. Listening audience, thank you for tuning in. The red button on the bottom, please subscribe so you can we have a really good lineup coming up. Subscribe to the channel so you get information as each time a new show comes up, and click on the bell. There's a little bell on your YouTube, and that will alert you every time something new comes up. And you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Solon. Always great to be here.
All righty. Take care.
Thanks for watching our video. For experienced legal services in Washington, D.C., Alabama, and Washington State, visit our website at remislaw.com or call us at 1-833-329-1799.
When someone goes through a divorce, they lose their best friend. They lose their house. They lose their children. Any time away from your child is a loss. Let's face it, divorce kills. The average cost in the United States for a divorce is $13,000. It's not uncommon for divorce to cost well into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. At Remus, we take into consideration you, the divorcing spouse, your property, your money, and your children. We assist clients in directing them to therapy, mentorship programs, savings. We mitigate the cost of divorce to keep your expenses down. We look out for the client holistically.
I came to Remus Law seeking a divorce. Solon listened to me. I told him my story. When he mailed me a copy of the complaint, which summarized my story, he was able to say exactly what I had been feeling for so many years. When my husband was served with the complaint, he came to me with tears in his eyes. He said he didn't know this is how I was really feeling. He asked if we could try again.
At Remus, we do all that we can for our clients.
Wait a little bit longer, wait a little, we'll be coming around again, 'cause you know we're stronger than we were when you and I began. I don't know what's harder, holding on or letting go. I don't know if we oughta, know if we oughta, know I know. I don't know where we're going, but I know it's gonna be good. I don't know where we're going, but I know it's gonna be good.
The lessons taught in the adventures of Uncle Billy and Ross are lessons that adults learn late in life. Some never learn it. I will recommend every parent, every young person, every adult read this book. But more importantly, apply the lessons.